Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. I have to tell you, I was late to the party on another bait. I think if you guys watch my channel on a regular basis, you know how much I talk about how important it is to have confidence in the baits that you use. I personally would much rather go out and fish a tournament with five baits that I have complete confidence in versus trying to fish five baits that maybe are the hot baits for that lake, even though I've never caught them on those baits before. I think confidence is such an important thing in fishing. And when you have confidence in a bait, generally what that means is you have really good understanding of how and when that bait performs under certain conditions. And that's what allows you to be so good with those baits. The downside to using baits that you're very confident in, at least for me, is I tend not to try a lot of new baits. Today's video is brought to you by the Deep Dive app, which will help you select the best fishing places in the lake with features like the lake level, the current flow, the top baits tool, which will help you select the best baits for certain locations throughout the lake. Whether that's a clear water, stained water, dirty water, it'll choose the best bait for that location, provide you with all the information like what structure, what retrieve, different reel, all of the information that you need to catch the fish. This is in the app. The cool part about this app, though, is it's not just based on areas. It does provide you with specific tournament winning data that has been collected to help you figure out your best choices for baits and locations for whatever region of the lake it is that you want to fish. On top of that, not only does the app provide you with best locations, it gives you water clarity as well. So maybe you're on a lake like Lake Eufaula, where there is a bunch of different water clarity located throughout the entire lake. This will help you identify the clearest portions as well as the dirtiest portions of the lake. Plus, the Deep Dive app has now added the wind effect map, which is going to take all of the different wind conditions for the past couple of days and show you what banks on the lake are being hit the hardest. They also have inflow points that show you different places throughout the lake where your water is being flushed into the lake through different ditches and creeks and rivers, providing you with high percentage places to fish and letting you know what parts of the lake are going to be the best areas after a rain. Check out the Deep Dive app to help you become a better angler. And one of the new baits that I was 100% late to the party on, when I say new baits really for me is this guy right here. Now, I have talked about this on the channel. And when I say new, it's really new for this year, meaning I've spent a lot of time fishing with it because I've heard how much other guys have been crushing them on this guy, the hitworm by Berkeley. Now, a lot of it is the Magnum hitworm, but they make a regular hitworm as well, and the Max Scent material that has just been crushing them. When that bait came out, which was probably, man, I'm gonna say probably 4 years ago. I'm guessing 4 years ago. Uh, I knew there were guys using it, but I didn't. It's hard sometimes to decipher whether people are promoting baits because they're sponsored by baits or whether or not they're actually catching fish on it. One of the guys that was talking about the Magnum hitworm and the hitworm a lot right off the bat was John Cox. Well, John Cox is a fellow guy on the Berkeley pro staff. And I just didn't, it was one guy talking about it, right? And I had never really talked to him about it. And I really didn't hear much else other than the Magnum hitworm from John Cox. Well, the last 2 or 3 years now, since that first time I kind of heard anybody using it, you kind of hear about people throwing the hitworm in all these different areas. And really last year was when it blew up for me, where a lot of other fellow pro anglers are throwing the hitworm. Guys, one of the best ways for me to tell whether it's legit in terms of that bait's catching them is when I know other touring anglers are using it and it's not one of their sponsors, right? Like, to me, that is the strongest way to convince me to say, hey, stop throwing something you have confidence in, pick up this new bait and go with it. Well, last year it was pretty crazy to me how many top level pros were throwing the hitworm and the Magnum hitworm and catching fish on it. So that really, during the off season, that was one of the baits I'm like, I got to spend a lot of time playing around with. And this year, I have caught a ton of fish on the hitworms. Now, I would say 75% of the time I throw the Magnum hitworm, but I'm very much throwing the regular size hitworm as well. So I wanted to share with you guys how I like to fish it. The ways that I've caught probably, I'm gonna say the majority of my fish on it this year. Maybe pretty standard, maybe not as standard as you would think. So let's dive into these different setups. The way that I heard the majority of guys fishing it was on a NACO rig. So this was kind of the way I started throwing it this year. So this is the two colors I really like, green pumpkin, obviously, and then the plum apple is another killer color. There's a lot of good colors, but those tend to be the two colors that I throw the most. But the NACO rig was like, that was the way I was hearing most guys throwing it. So obviously that's what I started with, and I started catching an absolute ton of fish. And one of the keys to this bait is the little tail on it. So you've got a lot of tapering here, and the bait tends to fall with a nice movement, but I almost feel like the tail is doing a lot of swimming motion regardless of how the bait's falling, whether it's falling more like a wacky rig or nose down, the tail's always kind of moving on it, has a lot of natural motion. But when you're fishing the NACO rig, when it hits the bottom, the bait kind of stands up, but that tail kind of does one of these things. So it moves around, generates a lot of bites, got a lot of success as soon as I started using it. So once I started catching fish on it, that's when I started thinking, okay, how else can I apply this? And one of the ways, and it just kind of happened to line up with us coming out with the Ozark rig and being the Ozark rig something I love, but was to fish the Magnum hitworm on the core tackle Ozark rig. And this, I think, is really what sealed it for me as in this is a fish catcher and I'm just loving it. And it has to do with the way this bait falls in the water column, being that the weight is tapered. I've talked about it before. The Ozark rig falls much more horizontal in the water column. What we found once we started fishing some of the bigger worms, like the Magnum hitworm, is when the bait falls, it actually rocks back and forth, and the tail just swims. It looks like a snake moving through the water column. So for me, as soon as I tried the hitworm on it, I really fell in love with it. And I started using it all over the place, catching a pile of fish. I've done videos on this setup, so you guys can go look at the proof in that. I'll link if I remember, I'll link the video where I was fishing deep weed lines with this exact setup, so you can see me catch some really nice fish on it. But it's just one of those baits that, okay, now I was like, I'm catching them on the NACO rig, I'm catching them on the Ozark rig, and it just started becoming a worm that I would reach for. So another setup I love to fish it on is a drop shot, catching a ton of fish on a drop shot. It's actually one where I started drop shotting the regular size hit worm for smallmouth up at St. Lawrence. Start catching them that way. I've been catching them here at my house on the regular size one. Just a really good setup. I also like to fish the regular size hit worm on the hover rig. That's another way I've been catching a bunch of fish. But it's just one of those baits. I feel like, I know I'm 100% certain I was late to the party on it. But now that I'm on the bus, riding the bus with the Magnum hitworm, I wanted to share it with you guys because it really is a phenomenal bait. I know it sounds like a sponsor plug because it's coming from Berkeley, but I admit this was one that I was not using. It didn't look like anything super special for me, and it took me way too long to get on it. I feel the same way about like the chatterbait. When the chatterbait came out, I got a couple right away, didn't catch anything on it, put it aside, and never picked it up again for like 3 years. And it took a lot of me getting beat in the head to use it. And that's exactly how I feel about the Magnum hitworm and the regular size hitworm as well. So if you haven't tried it, I'd recommend trying it. I really do think you might find that you like this bait. Extremely versatile, works great. Drop shot, NACO rig, and throw it on the Ozark rig. Throw it on a hover rig too. But the Ozark rig, you'll see it and instantly be like, gosh dang, that looks good. All right, guys. Anyways, I just wanted to share this with you. New video coming out tomorrow. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned. We'll see you tomorrow.